Hello, everybody. We'll give it a couple seconds to let people enter the room, and then we'll get started. Welcome. We have a wonderful crowd here tonight. Welcome. Okay, wow, we're over 500 and still coming in. So we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Fear-Hinsey, and as the chair of Fordham's Department of Theology, I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual space and to our spring 2021 first year experience lecture and conversation entitled "Only a Criminal Can Change the World, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Imperative of Disobedience." Tonight, we are honored to welcome religious scholar Professor Willie James Jennings of Yale University, who will reflect in conversation with Professor Rufus Burnett Jr. of Fordham's Theology faculty on Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy for today, particularly from our perspectives as explorers of religion and theology, focusing on King's famous 1963 piece, studied in all of our first year theology classes this year, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Professor Jennings will also receive and respond to many of your questions, which we hope you will submit at any time during this evening using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Fordham Theology's First Year Experience series was conceived several years ago as a way to enable students in our Faith and Critical Reason courses to take their learning outside and beyond the classroom by sharing an evening of thinking and reflecting more deeply together with an eminent scholar or practitioner of religion on how what King has written and what the students have studied relates to issues and concerns in our tumultuous and troubled real 21st century world. This creative and exciting series, now in its third year, has been made completely possible thanks to the generosity of some of our wonderful supporters of Fordham's theology program. And I'm really pleased to say that we have with us this evening, Mr. Jack and Mrs. Sylvia Picard-Schmidt, our principal supporters for this year's first year series, along with Margaret Marushak, who has also provided us with substantial support. So on behalf of our students, faculty, and Fordham, thank you, Sylvia, Jack, and Margaret so very, very much. I must also thank all of our Faith and Critical Reason students and instructors who are here with us for bridging your studies in your particular classrooms with this broader communal exploration tonight. Thanks too to all the students, alums, friends, community members, and supporters of theological education at Fordham for taking the time to join us tonight. Though we are in a virtual space, it's really thrilling to be able to be here and to think together through a religious theological lens about subject matter that truly matters. But now let us turn to our main business of the evening. And to do that, I want to introduce my wise and gifted theological colleague, Professor Rufus J. Burnett Jr. Professor Burnett, who joined our faculty in 2018, has very quickly become an integral member of our faculty and Fordham community. Dr. Burnett is widely sought out by our Fordham students for courses like Faith and Critical Reason, of course, but also courses like Spirituals, the Blues, and African American Christianity. And he's widely admired for his innovative scholarship, including his most recent book entitled Decolonizing Revelation, a spatial reading of the blues. So I'm happy to turn the microphone over now to Dr. Burnett, who will introduce Dr. Jennings and lead us into the conversation that we're very excited to begin now.
Thank you, Dr. Fear-Hinsey, for that warm introduction. I am so pleased and excited to be here tonight, and I want to wish you all a warm welcome into this moment that we have prepared here. And it's my honor first to introduce Dr. Willie James Jennings. So Dr. Willie James Jennings is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale Divinity School in New Haven, Connecticut. And he is also an ordained minister in the Baptist tradition. He's the author of over 50 articles and 4 very transformative books, which include The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race by Yale University Press. And this book won the American Academy of Religion Award of Excellence in the Study of Religion in the constructive reflective category. And it also received the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, which is the largest prize for theological work in North America. More recently, he has published Acts, a commentary subtitled The Revolution of the Intimate for the Belief series with Westminster and John Knox Press, which received the Reference Book of the Year Award for the Academy of Parish Clergy in 2018. And last but not least, one that is becoming one of my favorites that I've referenced in some of my many dialogues with some of our faculty and students on campus, After Whiteness, an Education in Belonging, which I think will also be award-winning as well. In addition to these writings, Dr. Jennings is also a contributor to Religion Dispatches, an online journal dedicated to the critical thought in the areas of religion, politics, and culture. And I would also add that beyond these very formal accolades, Dr. Jennings is a lover. He is a lover of justice. He is a lover of the intellectual life. In fact, he oftentimes will refer to himself as a Christian intellectual before he refers to himself as a Christian theologian or a systematic theologian. And I'm so grateful to be with him again. We were together in 2014 at the American Academy of Religion conference in Baltimore, Maryland, where I understood some of the kernels of his last book, After Whiteness, an Education in Belonging. It was there where Jennings stopped graciously to motivate me to finish my dissertation on the blues. And he simply said, "Brother, that's massive, but we need it." At that time, it was only about 2 sentences on the page, but I'm very grateful that he, much like his own work, really wants students to belong to the practice of theological education. Now tonight, so thank you, Dr. Jennings, for that. So tonight, Dr. Jennings has graciously agreed to share with us his insights and reflections on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. Under this theme, Only a Criminal Can Change the World, MLK and the Moral Imperative of Disobedience. But myself and Dr. Jennings do not want to go at this alone. My good friends, Dr. Bob Davis and Dr. Christiana Zinner, have agreed to field your questions. You can add your questions to our conversation. You can add your comments to our conversation tonight by using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please enter and submit your questions as soon as they bubble up in your spirit and out of your fingertips and onto your keyboard. All right, so I want to get right into this, Dr. Jennings, with this first question. All right. So one of the things that really impressed me about your work is your way with words. You really want your reader to belong. You have a care for your reader. And so I want to begin with some of these words that were written in 2013 in an article you wrote for Religion Dispatches. And I think it will become clear by the end of me reading these words why we're starting here. The article was entitled Becoming the Common: Why I Got Arrested in North Carolina. And I quote, "This week something happened to me. It was a moment of clarification. I have been writing a commentary on the book of Acts. I was considering the words that I had written regarding Acts 4, which is the famous story of Peter and John getting arrested and thrown into jail for speaking about the new order established by the resurrected Jesus, and an impeccable fact hit me. I must get arrested." Could you reflect on these words, which describe a moment where you, like King, became a criminal for the sake of what you see as the moral imperative of becoming the common?
Well, thank you, Professor Burnett, for that Great question. And I want to thank you for that absolutely wonderful introduction. It's a joy for me to be here with you and to be with your wonderful colleagues in the theology department and to be with these fabulous students. I've looked forward to this invitation, this time, since you invited me. So I am so glad to be here to think about the significance of King and his moral witness. And my own work, as I've tried to, as anyone who has paid attention to it as you have, to try to align myself with King's vision. Well, the crucial thing for me is to think about the relationship between a moral order and a social order. A moral order and a social order are not the same thing. And the law stands between a moral order and a social order. And I, as a Christian intellectual, as you nicely described me, and as a Black man in America, understand that I stand between them, a social order and a moral order. And the social order can be immoral. And that immorality can be seen in the laws and public policies that serve the powerful. Now, the first person who taught me this was my father. He knew that the racial order and the social order and the law that undergirded the racial order and the social order were woven together. And none of it, Professor Burnett, none of it was shaped in my favor. So I grew up with a vow that I made to my dad, that I would do everything in my power to never be on the wrong side of the law, to never get arrested. This is the vow that you know very well that many wise Black fathers always press on their sons. Right. My dad pressed this vow on me, not simply because he wanted me to be a law-abiding citizen, but more specifically because he knew that my citizenship was not being honored by the law itself. Now, King understood that much in life comes down to where you see yourself placed. He wanted us to understand that the social order and the law that undergirds the social order must be aligned with the moral order. Now, what is the moral order? That God demands justice and fairness, and that the poor, the widow, the orphan, the homeless, those at the margins of society must be cared for. But more than just care and concern, an unjust social order characterized by, first and foremost, serving the rich and the powerful must be turned right side up. That's a moral order. That an unjust social order that continues to cultivate white supremacy and white hegemony must be overturned. Now, the difficulty King faced, and that we face, is that too many people collapse their vision of what is moral into the law, what is legal. So that the idea of an unjust and immoral set of laws is difficult for many people to understand. The idea that some laws and some regulations, some public policies, some aspects of the judicial system and processes, judicial processes, can be or become immoral or unjust is for some people unfathomable because they have not fully appreciated how what is legal has been served to form those in power and those with resources. So King was arrested, gained a criminal record, deemed a criminal.
Yes, sir.
And let's be clear, he was a follower of Jesus who was arrested, gained a criminal record, and was deemed a criminal. There's a pattern. There's a pattern here, and we must see that if one wishes to change the social order, this is what's so important. I want the students to make sure they capture this. If one wishes to change the social order, if one wishes to stand against injustice, if one wishes to see a moral order aligned more tightly with the social order and the law and public policies and regulations, then it might be necessary to be arrested and to be deemed a criminal, it might be necessary to engage in holy civil disobedience. Now, we have to take this seriously. There is something terrifying about having your life in the hands of the police and the court systems, and it is never to be taken lightly. My dear friend, Reverend Dr. William Barber talks about this. It is no joke. It is no stunt to enter into civil disobedience.
Indeed.
When you do that, you are saying that the alignment between the law and injustice must be broken, and that I will place my body between the law and injustice. And I'm also saying that my body will now be placed in the work of changing the social order. So this brings us back to the title of our time tonight, that there is something crucial, especially for those of us who are Christian, there is something crucial about the reality of the criminal. In Scripture, especially in the New Testament, Jesus tells us that in order to find him, we have to go to the places where people would not imagine that he would be. And one of the crucial places is in the prison. He is there.
Yes.
And in fact, there's another place in the New Testament where it says, always keep in mind those in prison as though you were in prison yourself, right? And the reality of the Christian is because we are about a new social order, an order that speaks an alignment of the social order with the moral order. We are always poised to being those who are seen as problematic. Not because we're trying to create problems, it's simply because we understand, in the words of the late John Lewis, that sometimes you have to create good trouble. But it is this reality of the criminal that is so important for us, because it's a jarring reality that we have to get our minds around, that what it means to be moral and what it means to be someone who never gets in trouble with the law are not the same thing. In fact, someone who never gets in trouble with the law, who always agrees with every law, every social policy, all public policy, all regulations, may be, in the way they're living their lives, profoundly immoral.
That's a lot of meat on that bone, Dr. Jennings. Where do I start? So I want to stick back on that article really quickly, because you're getting into criminality, right? We have to embrace this criminality on behalf of doing the good, right?
Yeah.
Aligning the moral order and the social order, you're saying.
Yes.
Right? So that takes a lot of risk.
Yes, it does.
And so you in that same article, you reflect upon that two things that your parents hope for you. The first thing that they hope for you is that you would be a Christian.
Yes.
As a member of the Baptist tradition, I can definitely recognize that hope, the pressure of that hope. Also, they hope that you wouldn't be arrested, which you already kind of talked about. I think it's important for our first year students to kind of wrestle with this moment in which the hope that brings them into the world forces them to think about these moments of non-alignment between the moral order and the social order, and how they are wresting a notion of hope for what they are building, imagining, thinking through as their own contribution to possibly King's legacy.
Yes.
Tell us about this risk. You really go, you talk about your family, you talk about what it might have meant for you to be arrested and the precarity of that kind of a situation.
Absolutely.
Take us through that discernment process of facing that risk.
Well, at the time, I was I've been married for many years, and I had two daughters, and they were in school, one in college, one in high school, moving through. Wonderful wife. And I said to them, family, I'm going to have to do this. And of course, they understood. They were not happy. They understood. But I explained to them why I had to do this. I had to do this because the injustices that were a part of the social fabric of life in North Carolina were already bad, and they were about to be exacerbated by new laws, new public policies that would make life even more difficult for people. And so it became clear to me that I could not keep silent when I was watching public policies being formed that would make life more difficult. And here's where we have to think about two realities of obedience, Brother Rufus, two realities of obedience. There is the reality of obedience that for me is a part of my Christian faith, which is I must obey as a disciple of Jesus. I must enter fully into the way of Jesus, which is to stand against anything that would seek to destroy life, right? And so that was that reality of obedience. But then there was the other reality of obedience that the students listening in are very familiar with. Anyone who makes it to college, and especially a wonderful institution, a wonderful institution like Fordham, anyone who comes to college is someone who has learned how to obey. I mean, you were the student who did what you were supposed to do. You obeyed. And the gift of your obedience is to wind up in one of the finest institutions on the planet. So obedience is already a part of the fabric of who you are. The danger is that reality of obedience can breed an insidious docile reality in your life, that you can become someone who, without thinking, first offer obedience. And that obedience, if not thought through, if not understood, can place you on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of the moral order. And so the risk always is to discern what your obedience means. Now, for someone entering their college career, this is a new step, because you have been aligned with the obedience required of you by your parents, by your teachers, by the authority figures in your life. And that's wonderful. You've done the right thing. But there's a point at which their obedience that guided you must now become your obedience that moves you forward. And as a Christian, for me, my obedience now had to now enter fully into what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus. So the risk was to step into a reality of obedience that looked to the world as disobedience. And here's what we have to remember. Here's what I have to remember, Brother Rufus, about these matters.
Absolutely.
So the life of Jesus, he was seen by the officials, the religious officials and the state officials. He was seen as a disobedient person, when in point of fact, those who are part of his inner life understood that what the world saw as disobedience was actually obedience to God. And so, so then people ask, well, what's the difference? How do you know when your obedience is the right thing, or your disobedience seen by others is the right thing? If it's aimed at placing your body between life and the forces of death,
yes.
then you have the right compass. Then you are aimed toward what must be. So I got arrested because I knew that if these policy recommendations that were moving through the state legislature, if they were turned into law, people's lives would be at stake. Not just the quality of life, that actual being able to live was on the table now. And so to see that, and to see that clearly, required of me a decision. And so the risk that everyone must take if they are interested in a moral order being aligned with the social order is, what does the suffering of others mean to you? What does the disadvantage, the closing down of options in the lives of others mean to you?
That's amazing. That's an amazing place for us. That's an amazing stopping point for us to transition to a question that you spent some a great amount of time wrestling with in your first book, The Christian Imagination. One of the things that really is important about that text is that as you talk about obedience, as you're talking about what it takes to be the driver of your own obedience, moving from your parents' desire to be obedient, moving from authority figures. There are a lot of ideas that are seductive in pulling our obedience in the wrong direction.
Yes.
And so while we think we might be being disobedient, we may be being obedient. And one of those ideas, I think, is race that you talk about in this text. And one of the things that's important about this, I think, is the way that in that text you call out and trace these supremacist logics and how they have colluded with the Christian imagination.
Yes.
Can you take us into some of those ideas and how those ideas kind of prefigure this moment of conflict between the Alabama clergymen, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights that was led by Fred Shuttlesworth at the time?
Yeah. Yeah. The letter is so important for showing us some of these deep problems. And it is in many ways a sign of King's genius that he diagnoses these problems there in the response of the Alabama clergymen. Well, you see, the Alabama clergymen accepted the racial condition of the Western world as given. And so they imagined that the civil rights of Black people could be achieved through a gradual change, what King called the sin of gradualism. They believed that it could be achieved through a gradual change in law and public policy and social policy that in effect, however, would leave in place the economic, educational, political, and social status quo. To have your cake and eat it too, as it were, your moral cake and eat it too. What their resistance to King, and we have remembered that there was a lot of resistance to King in the movement. What their resistance to King in the movement showed was the intertwining of the racial imagination and Christianity. Brother Rufus, here's the thing that it's important for the students to understand. There is a Christian architecture to the modern racial condition, modern racial reasoning. And there is a racial architecture to modern Western Christianity, whether we're talking Catholic or Protestant. There is a racial architecture to modern Western Christianity. So let's think about this at two levels that we see working here in this important letter. The first is the creation of a racial society, as it were, and the cultivation of a civilized people, the creation of a racial society and the cultivation of a civilized people. You see, so when the early Europeans came to the New Worlds, they saw themselves sent here by God, by God's providence, to save the world. And that meant transforming land and peoples in order to create societies indicative of what God wants in the world. Now, here's what's crucial. They took very seriously the task of transforming the lands and the peoples because they believed that God had placed that responsibility solely in their hands. So they, in a sense, centered themselves in a kind of paternalistic vision over the entire planet. As Europeans, they saw themselves at the center of God's plan to create a stable social order. They were a sign of stability. They were a mark by which the rest of the planet could mark themselves. And so forms of identification that later on we more precisely would call race, racial identification, also figured in that form of stability. They were a sign of stability and a mark of maturity. And so what they were invested in is maintaining and bolstering a social order. And this was a hallmark of what we later call white Christianity. The creation, the sustaining and maintaining of a social order. And all those who would be affected by their work were brought into that same logic. So what this meant was that they imagined themselves as Christians as the very stabilizing center of a social order, as those charged to build it. So what does this mean? It means that their first disposition was not disruption, not overturning, not challenging. Their first disposition was to sustain, to build upon, to strengthen, because they imagined that the social order itself was already moving in the trajectory that God wanted. And so very often, where we're talking about the United States, or we come to the United States, or what we would call Latin America or Canada, or so many other colonial sites, and in the old world, Christians believed that they were the very bedrock of stabilizing the social order. So King was seen as really outside of the proper trajectory of what a Christian is supposed to do. Christian is supposed to stabilize the social order, not disrupt it. A Christian is supposed to build up the social order and always work in a sense to refine what was already basically moving in the right direction. So that's the first reality of it. The second reality of it is this cultivation of people.
Exactly.
So these Europeans saw themselves charged to bring the world to maturity. This is a crucial matter for us to understand. So they looked out on the entire planet, wherever these Christian colonial settlers went. They looked out on the entire planet as people in need of being brought to maturity. They saw the whole world as students and themselves as the teachers. And what comes with being a teacher? Evaluation. Exactly. You're constantly evaluating to determine whether people are moving forward, growing, and whether they are becoming acceptable and accepted as those who should be allowed to fully enter society and even possibly lead. And so it was a form of Christianity that imagined that people had to earn the right.
That's right.
To earn the right, a meritocracy rooted in maturity, earn the right to fully participate, especially in the decision-making of a society. And so the educational apparatus that Christians created, the educational programs Christians created, were very often deeply woven with white supremacy, woven with this unrelenting white paternalism of constantly evaluating where people have matured enough to be listened to. And then as a next step, whether they have the right to share in leadership. So King was coming up against this as well, because the gradualism that he was fighting against were people who were, and he read it right. You are saying that we're not ready to be listened to. We're not ready to share fully. We're not ready to lead. And all of this was woven on the ground through segregation, because segregation is the key to both creation and cultivation. Why? Because segregation is always about control, controlling not only where people live, but because you control where they live, you control how they live. Now, King's letter comes at both of these problems. And that's the genius of the letter. He calls into question this way of positioning Christianity as, in a sense, the pillar that holds up society rather than that which critiques society. He challenges the kind of white supremacy that says we don't have to listen to Black flesh and respect their words as fully speaking to us about what God demands and what is necessary for a thriving society. And so his letter is brilliant in that regard of capturing really what's fundamental to the rise of the Western racial condition and to white supremacy.
Thank you for that rich rendering there of that question, this notion of race and how it functions to separate us, and the power dynamics associated there as well with the colonial settler looking to the colonized as people that they had to evaluate and determine whether or not they had reached civility, reached faithfulness, reached rationality. And one of the things that situates this text here at Fordham is this course on faith and reason, right? And so this text in particular is a way for us to engage students in thinking about faith and reason. And one of the things that strikes me about the letter, when you help me think through this, is that King situates in his response to the clergyman, right after the memorial on the injunction to end protests, right? King and company decide that they have to determine whether or not they're going to march because the bailout fund is low.
Yes.
Right. And so they have to come to this decision. Well, if we march, we are certainly going to be arrested. Right. And we certainly aren't going to get bailed out. And so we don't know. We're going to be in a precarious situation. But in his response, even in the face of that to the clergyman, you can see how he sees civil disobedience as faithful to the Christian tradition and reasonable given the context of Birmingham. Let's talk about waiting and being patient and so forth. And at that time, we know that Birmingham was considered to also by the nickname Birmingham because of the number of bombings of homes and churches for people who were involved in the movement and people who were a symbol for those to prevent them, this terroristic symbol, to prevent them from being involved. So can you speak to the most salient points in this in this letter, where King is using faith and reason, all the while having been born through and into and received by the eye of the European as simply Black flesh? I'm thinking about Hortense Spillers here.
Yes.
And that moment to me seems very apropos because this letter comes to us as such a shining example of what faith and reason can be. But all the while, that Black flesh is looked upon as incapable of being faithful, incapable of being reasonable. Can you take us in there for a second?
Yes, and that's a beautiful way you put it. So let's take what's crucial and really at the heart of this letter, and that is King's constant negotiation with violence. And in point of fact, what he does throughout his life and what he does throughout this moment is highlight the irrationality of violence. Yet violence has been seen as not only a rational act, but an incredibly effective act. And so part of King's brilliant strategy here and the way in which faith and reason is working is that he wants to, in a sense, turn the logic of violence on its head. And this is what's key. So the clergy and others, the way in which they come at King, and this is not the only time, but people come at King because, in this way, they say, because you will bring down upon us and upon yourself violence. You will be the bringer of violence. If you come here, things will escalate and violence will happen. And we just don't want that to happen. And people will be hurt. But King understood two crucial matters about violence. First, he had to call into question the deep American commitment to violence as a means to an end. And this is crucial because, in a sense, this is challenging a particular configuration of faith and reason that's a part of the fabric of Christianity in America. We have always been, those Christians in this country have always been able to reconcile violence with our faith, to hold reason and faith together in a beautiful symmetry with the deployment of violence. Either the violence of the nation state or the violence that made possible the nation state. We sing it in the national anthem. Well, King, from the very beginning, and I think a lot of people start to see this, that the civil rights movement was a challenge to that very fabric, a challenge to that way of imagining violence as a means to an end. And so non-violent direct action and civil disobedience was, in a sense, to capture what faithfulness to the Christian tradition actually should mean, as opposed to what it had come to mean in this country. Because this country, I mean, we could speak of this in terms of a kind of just warrior theory, but that really wasn't what's at play in America. In America, what was at play is the ease with which the creation of the nation was seen as a providential act that mapped Old Testament ideas of Israel taking Canaan onto the American landscape.
That's right.
And so King was challenging that profoundly, and in that way, in a sense, capturing, saving, if you will, the Christian tradition from a terrible way of imagining faith and reason aligned with violence. And what he was also doing was calling to question any posture of Christian faithfulness that imagined that we could align faith in some future role with violence. That the very structure of a civil society, the structure of a just society, of a beloved community, cannot happen with the deployment of violence. And this is, as we know, this is so crucial for us at this moment when we are in the midst of a reality in which an amendment has become like scripture, killing scripture for us all. And I'm referring to the Second Amendment here, that it's become killing scripture to us all because of the underwriting, not only of violence, but this country is the greatest producer, the greatest distributor, manufacturer of weapons the world has ever seen. And so King's very way of holding together faith and reason spoke against that. Obviously, there was another level in which the reasonableness of it all spoke, and that is, in a country so wed to violence, in a country even in the 60s awash with weapons, any kind of armed resistance was already playing into the hands of a destructive narrative.
Yes,
Already pouring gasoline on a fire. And to imagine independence, self-possession inside of armed resistance was already a fool's gold. Now, of course, here's what we know. That fool's gold has been sold to so many peoples in so many countries. And it has always ended, and it continues to end badly. there is no freedom. There is no freedom if it begins being imagined inside armed resistance.
Yes, there's something there, and you've worked with this word before, this notion of desire. There's something being desired in that Second Amendment.
Yeah.
There's something being desired there, and I want to dovetail, keeping that thought about desire. We have some questions coming up from the Q&A. We're going to transition to our Q&A session. You've led us so beautifully into this point to where we can open up and share with so many of our viewers. So, and please excuse me if I mispronounce your last name, Daniel. Daniel Luchine asks, what do you think about conflicting moral orders? Right. So you definitely see this in the tension between King and the clergyman. Given the polarization and diversity of viewpoints in the U.S., what do we do when the moral codes that are passed down in some people's holy spaces are in conflict with others?
That's a great question. What we have to do is become excellent storytellers and listeners of story. That's the key. So we never want to think about a moral order in the abstract. And that's important for the students to understand this. To speak of a moral order is never to speak in the abstract. It's to speak inside the long history of the West and the history of this country. And it's to speak inside the stories that are often not told, the stories of indigenous peoples, the stories of Asian Americans now, the stories of Latinx peoples, the stories of all those who have felt the boot of oppression and violence. And so to think of a moral order, you have to build it up from the stories, right? And there, what you wind up is not seeing two equally different visions of a moral order standing against each other. What you see is the weaving of a moral order and the thwarting of it, the challenging of it. So it places you in a different position to think about the moral order. One of the great dangers in ethics is to think abstractly. You never want to, you want to think historically. And then when you move from there, then you realize, yes, there are conflicts, but the conflicts aren't over option A and option B. The conflict is over those who benefit by now the social order and those who are disadvantaged by it. And that it doesn't take an incredible amount of analysis to see that, but it does take an incredible amount of courage to acknowledge it.
Absolutely. We've got a few more questions coming down the pipe here. So this question is more of a specific question aimed at one of the first questions that we started with in your article from Legit Dispatches. They were asking about the specific, this is from Alex Bonsacker. Please forgive me for mispronouncing your last name if I did. What was the specific laws that you were protesting in North Carolina?
Great question. There were this was a part of the Moral Monday movement under the leadership of the Reverend Dr. William Barber and the NAACP of North Carolina, and a number of other groups that were also aligned with that important work, especially the clergy of North Carolina. So the particular, in each Moral Monday, we picked some issues by which we were willing to be arrested for. And my particular week, there were two crucial things. First, healthcare. There were some proposals in the state legislature that if they were to be passed, they would have made it much more difficult for people to access healthcare. And I knew at the time that in many parts of the Carolinas, especially North Carolina, the healthcare situation of people was critical. The other issue was unemployment. At the time, unemployment was very high, and the state legislature was refusing to extend unemployment insurance, which meant that people were literally going to go without money for food, to keep their lights on, to pay their bills. People are going to be kicked out of their homes, very much like with the situation that we're in now. And this was about to happen immediately. And so it wasn't a question of, would this happen a month or two down the road? It was about to happen, which meant that people were literally going to be in a situation where they had no resources. And so at that moment, I mean, there were other things going on. Absolutely. And it's not as though the other things going on I wouldn't have been arrested for, but at that moment, I realized I can't sit on the sidelines because people's lives are now hanging in the balance.
Absolutely. So I'm going to paraphrase a few questions, kind of condense them together. There's this tension that's coming in through the chat, brought to you by Alan Jenkins and Viva Sanjeev. And they're trying to think about kind of at what point does civil disobedience become plain old criminal, right? And when are we kind of crossing that line, right? Particularly when we're thinking about the protests of George Floyd, just around in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery this summer. And then, like, how does the present capitalist economic system kind of over determine how we think about crossing that line?
Right.
Because of private property, we think about things of this nature.
Right. This is an excellent question. So here's a couple things to keep in mind, especially for your students to understand that. And if some of the folks who are part of the civil rights movement were here with us, what they would say immediately is that, there was training necessary to engage in civil disobedience. In fact, the day I was going to be arrested, I had to come early in the day and basically go through a full day workshop of what to do and what not to do before I'll be arrested, because it was a disciplined act. Now, so the question about, well, when does it go over the line? Well, the first thing I have to recognize that if it's a disciplined act, we are already starting to think about that. But let's take the two ends of it. At the one end of it, one is getting arrested because one is placing one's body between injustice and law and public and social policy and regulation. So you're placing your body for the sake of others. That's why you're doing it. At the other end of it, you are shunning all forms of violence. It's nonviolent. You're shunning anything that would be destructive, that would in any way, shape, or form hurt life, right? So at those two ends, with a disciplined approach, you're pretty clear on what you're doing. But now, that being said, let's be clear. In this country, private property has always been seen as important and oftentimes more important than human life. And so one of the things that I and many others will continue to be frustrated by is the constant holding up of private property to human life. And we see this constantly. Absolutely. So if there is a protest and windows are broken and shops, this is held up as a moral equivalent to life being lost.
Absolutely.
And we have to understand the history of that. And I want your students to understand this. The history of private property, race and private property form together in the modern world. And so the idea that private property can be seen as important as a person's life is an absurdity that I want your students to understand is an absurdity. No property is as important as any life. Now, that doesn't mean that, we should be about the destroying of property, but it is a profound, sick calculus, immoral calculus to hold up broken windows as somehow equivalent to the loss of life, somehow equivalent to the diminishment of a thriving life.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. This question comes from Sean Hoover. He's concerned about the ways in which King uses extremism to refer to people like Jesus. It's usually a negative connotation, but King embraces it positively. Can you reflect on that for us?
This is important, and we want to hold on to that. King is exegetically, and for the student, that means in terms of the way he interprets things. Mm-hmm. I think he's exactly right. Mm-hmm. Remember, when Jesus stood before Pilate, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Mm-hmm. Right? And so there is an extreme reality to the overturning of the social order. There's an extreme reality to the aligning of a moral order to a social order. There's an extreme reality in saying that those who don't have enough food, those who don't have housing, those who don't have health care ought to have it, not because they've earned it, but because it is a basic human right.
Absolutely.
And so here's what we must always keep in mind. Extremism in this regard is a good word. Now, of course, in our public discourse and in the way often these things are interpreted in the media, extremism is layered across everything that is imagined as outside the norm. Mm-hmm. And here what we have to understand is that for many people in the world, and so I think it's very important for the students to understand this, for many people in the world, when they look at the United States of America, what they see is an entire reality of extremism. What do I mean by that? We consume more of the world's resources than any other country in the world. We consume more of the natural resources. We consume more of the financial resources. We take twice as much as a country than any other country. And so from the perspective of a lot of countries, this is an extreme place. It does not know how to only take its fair share. So this is the reality that we're inside of. And so extremism is not necessarily a bad word, if in fact we're thinking of it as something that moves against violence, and not something that underwrites violence.
Yeah. And along that same line with this notion of extremism as a way of, the moral imperative towards civil disobedience, it strikes me that when we think about King's letter, maybe some of the things that we may have seen from King had he lived longer, mm-hmm. right? I mean, his life, stopped so short. We almost got about 40 years from him, maybe, was it?
Yes.
It stopped so short. And so several things here that I want to kind of fuse a couple of questions together. So those of you who have written them, please excuse me for not singling you out. But I think I want to condense these for sake of clarity. There is a tension amongst a number of people who are involved in movements to protect vulnerable lives in the 60s. So we can think of Malcolm X, right? And how he's been kind of pit against King, right? As this kind of a Black nationalist kind of perspective that's coming out of the Nation of Islam. But of course, Malcolm X isn't completely defined by the Nation of Islam. He's a developing figure. And so there's this notion, or there's always this tension about the right way to do civil disobedience, the correct way to protest and march and so forth. And then we see January 6th. No guns are unholstered, right? Very few deaths on the side of those who were storming the Capitol. Mm-hmm. we don't see the level of escalated violence in response to this. So it begs the question, why is it in this country that certain forms of civil disobedience are seen as more violent than others, even when they are less violent with respect to who is doing it and what skin color they may have, right? Can you take us into this?
Well, this is a part of what we talked about earlier. Violence is a part of the fabric of America.
Right.
But here's what we have to understand. We have been cultivated. We have been socialized to accept the deployment, the execution, and performance of violence in white bodies, especially in white male bodies. All of us have. I mean, if you've grown up with television and movies, you have been inculcated in the normalcy of angry white men acting violently and it being okay, and you not being terrified by it. And so there's a sense in which even now when people talk about it, you don't get the sense of terror in what they've seen. Outrage, shock, but not terror, right? But the thought of non-white bodies carrying violence and acting violence, there's a sense of terror that is there. And that's not by accident. It is the way in which the deployment of violence has been shaped in the Western psyche, if you will, right? So we imagine it's not only in our art, but it certainly is in the way the policy is imagined. White bodies protecting us against non-white bodies, domestic and foreign, who wish to do us harm, right? Now, unfortunately, the tragedy is that psyche, that way of thinking has deeply penetrated our religious consciousness. So even people of faith still imagine inside of that proper deployment of violence. And until we understand that we've accepted something as normative that is fundamentally cancerous, that is the acceptance of a right to violence, a right to anger, a right to lashing, that has been woven inside of a certain kind of white masculine persona. Until we recognize how not only deeply cancerous it is, but demonic it is, we will continue to function inside of it. And only many of us who feel the the full ramifications of it will be speaking out about it.
Absolutely. Okay, just to put a tighter point on this, what came to your mind when you saw the ways in which the protests of the summer of 2020 behind Black Lives Matter, and you saw the insurrection on January 6th? What did you think about that? What did you see that you think is telling for the legacy of this letter?
It is what I saw was the continued underbelly in many ways of the American psyche, that reality that's always been there. And so the same anger we saw in January 6th is the same kind of anger that King saw as he marched through not only southern cities, but northern cities. It's the same reality, the same way in which people yelled and screamed and had flags and called him, as he said, everything but a child of God. That same reality is there. And for me, what was, you because of, and you know this very well, those of us who study these matters, we're not surprised.
No.
We are saddened. We are saddened. And I was especially sad for students, especially, and I think of your students here at Fordham, to be here and to see this. But what's important is that they saw it.
Yeah.
And my hope is that this is an important teaching moment for us. And what I would say to your students is that they must understand deeply what January 6th means. If they don't, then they will not fully understand the country that they inhabit. They must come to understand that this is not an Aboriginal, this is not a Southern thing, this is not just a few fringe people. This is deeply woven into the very trajectory of America. But the reality of it is that there's always been a counter witness to that. There's always been a challenge to that. And they are now positioned to be a part of that challenge to that.
This question kind of takes us in this question from Brennan Bosco kind of takes us in a little bit of a different direction in thinking about moral issues clamoring for attention. Right. So a lot of, as a question come in, the list goes up and I miss my place. So a lot of people are concerned about abortion, right? Pope Francis, for example, talks about abortion, the death penalty, and racism and exclusion is immoral. Are they all equally immoral and deserving of civil disobedience? How do we choose which kinds of life issues to act upon with regards to civil disobedience?
Well, this is such an important question. And here we have to always make a distinction between what we see and what we sense a call for us to act against, right? And here's where it's so important for your students to think very carefully about where they are and when they are, right?
Yes.
So I don't want students to think about, I don't want them to say to themselves, I want to be a moral person. I want them to think, I want to be moral here in this place where I live. So what's going on here in this place where I live that speaks to the things that I need to be challenging, right? And so so let me give a perfect example. Are there homeless people where I am? Are there people who are profoundly impoverished? They don't have resources. They don't have food to eat. They can't pay their bills. Is there segregation around me? Is there gun violence? Is there violence against women? Is there violence against LGBTQ people? What is going on around me that I clearly can see and discern? And then as for those who are Christian, obviously this is the question, what is God saying to me I should be about? Who should I be listening to at this moment? Now, those are important questions to be asking. So instead of asking generically about a wide variety of moral issues, always bring it home, always bring it home. And there, Brother Rufus, I have never, I always say this to students, those who are Christian, you never have to ask what the will of God is for you. You never have to ask that question.
That's rich. That's rich.
The only thing you have to do is stop resisting what God is telling you to do. Because in the New Testament, there's no place where people are saying, well, what does God want us to do? What people are doing is resisting what God wants them to do. And so if I live in a community and there's homeless, that's pretty clear what I ought to be thinking about. If I'm in a community where there's poverty, that's pretty clear. I don't think I need to wonder I don't have a moral quandary.
Yeah, that's very interesting because the article, because the letter, we talk about this moral imperative and this legacy from Kant, right? The philosopher Kant, who's talking about the categorical imperative and we need to come up with an a priori understanding of what our moral ends are and so forth and so before we start to talk about what we need to do, right? And so I can hear that back critique of the abstract reasoning, we have to really decide what it is, what is the moral, I'm not trying to shame Kant, but
and we remember Kant was in as they say, in Königsberg, he was quite comfortable. I don't think he was worried about the rest of the planet at the time.
No. If we look at his anthropology, we can definitely see that.
Right. And so I think it's really important for us to especially for the students to remember, if you are someplace living and it's clear that you are attuned to what's going on around you, you already have, in a fundamental way, the map upon which you should deploy your moral compass.
Mhm. So I want to kind of trouble something a bit here with in conversation with our good friend here, Kristen Narain. Her question is very poignant, right? So MLK stays faithful to Christianity. Why doesn't he ever question God like James Baldwin or Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example? So I want to jump in with Kristen and say, what do you make of the dwindling numbers around people identifying themselves as Christian in this country, as we can see from Pew report, these different reports that have been coming out on this, and how and what do you feel that's part of the passion? At least I see it in your work that is driving us, and we want to close here because I think it's a great place for you to help us see in closing out our conversation for tonight where your next work might be going. That next book on the doctrine of creation is going to help us think about worlds. But we see a world where Christianity is in many ways not as seductive as a moral compass, as setting people's moral compass anymore. Can you help us with that, especially with that conversation about James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Yeah, it's there's always two things to recognize here. And King talks about it in the letter. He worries about the witness of a faith that is turning off. Even in his day, they were, as he said, turning off the young people. That at one level, what we are seeing is the continued demise of Christianity shaped inside and around whiteness. And that Christianity has always been dying. It's always been dying. But now and in some ways it's accelerating, if you will. And why is it accelerating? Because the witness is in many ways so tragic at this moment. The alignment of a number of Christians with the prior administration and with the conservatism that is heartless has turned off an incredible number of people, even within the white community, among the children and grandchildren of white Christians, both evangelical and mainline. So that reality has been with us for a long time. But there's the other side of it too, Brother Rufus, and that is, and this ties into the question I was asked, because people have been turned off, so many people have been turned off, and my sadness is to see so many people of color turned off, is that they don't realize that Baldwin's wrestling is a wrestling not first outside of faith. It's first a wrestling inside of faith. That is to say, he is yet inside the kind of moral universe that he was shaped in the church. But what's also crucial here is, and here's what's so sad about some of this, is that so many people don't know that there's a wrestling, a proper wrestling, a great wrestling, a deep wrestling that happens inside the faith. That one can be inside the faith, wrestling with the faith.
Yes.
And to be inside the faith, wrestling with the faith is exactly where King was, inside the faith, wrestling with the faith. But also recognizing that there are resources for living, visions for thriving, that are inside the wrestling with the faith, even wrestling against the faith.
Absolutely. I just want to give you an opportunity to illumine us about this next text before we go, particularly particularly because I think about people like Fannie Lou Hamer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And I think about folks like Ella Baker
mm-hmm.
and their work, particularly Fannie Lou Hamer's work with the Freedom Farm Cooperative in North Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very interested in this notion of how she really saw something different in terms of how she was working her notion of getting people back in touch with the land.
That's right. That's right. And so that's a beautiful segue to the next book. So in point of fact, and this ties to the last two questions and comments you were making, my dear brother. I'm working on a book on the doctrine of creation, and my hope is to help us see that, especially those of us who are Christian, that we have not had a doctrine of creation, and we've not had one that would do this work. Number one, that would bring us back to the land, and to bring us back to thinking of life together in place, and would be the site in which a Christianity that gathers, that draws people together, becomes a Christianity that people see and understand. And I would contend that because we haven't had a real doctrine of creation, people who've decided that they're not sure Christianity holds anything of promise for them, they haven't really been introduced to Christianity yet. So I'm hoping to help make that happen with the next one.
You've definitely done a good job of bringing us into that new opportunity to make it happen. And I definitely have so much to say, but we have to close up. And I'm very, very grateful to your graciousness to spend time with us tonight. And I want to thank our donors again, Jack Schmidt, Sylvia Pickard Schmidt, and Margaret Marushek. And I definitely want to also send a very warm welcome to my colleagues in the department who put this together, Bob Davis, Christiana Zinner, Christine Fire-Henze, and for all of my colleagues for trusting me with this task to dialogue with such an illustrative and accomplished guest. Thank you all for coming out tonight. God bless you and keep you. And we hope to see you again at another point in history. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings.
It's my pleasure to be with you, brother Rufus. And I also want to thank your colleagues and to thank the donors for making this wonderful opportunity possible for me.
Great. Good night, everyone.